Welcome back to Incremental, the continuous improvement podcast. This is our Concepts edition, episode 144. I'm Devin Bedoni of Like and Precision.
And I'm Uriel Eisen of Austere Manufacturing and ARDA. And today's quote, "Expediting is like a narcotic. The more you use it, the more you need." It's from Breaking the Logjam of Knowledge Work. And the link to the article is in the show notes, and it is an absolute banger head to tail.
It's very good. I was just reading it prior to hitting record, and I think I might print it out and have everybody read it at work tomorrow.
Ooh, that's a great call.
Yeah.
I should do the same.
It was funny. We were having a discussion last week. What was it about? It was a minutia discussion about like how to handle. I can just jump into it. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So we have our job scheduling board between programming and the shop floor.
Yep.
And the shop floor started setting up multiple carts for if there was multiple jobs programmed.
Okay.
So effectively they were giving us like inaccurate signal of like what our work needed to be done.
Oh, because they were pulling it off the board onto a cart, but that was sort of another buffer.
That was it's all sort of, it's kind of one large weird
Interesting.
buffer. But they were like, well, this is ready, let's get it done. But then we were getting the signal. Anyway, so we were having a discussion about it, and I was kind of bringing up the fundamental waste of overproduction, and like multiple people were like, yeah, I don't really believe that, but whatever.
It's a great article for that.
Yeah. So anyway, everybody's like willing to humor me and discuss, but I think for good reason, it's hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah. There's a reason most people don't do it.
Yeah. But this article I feel like is very accessible to lay people like ourselves, and also takes it out of the context of an assembly line or Toyota or any of that stuff, and is a very great. I also want to send this to some of my friends that work in construction, contracting, project management, because I feel like this really just like, it's not getting into the super nitty gritty, but it's really like placing a lot of these concepts in a very easy to understand context.
Yeah. And I mean, they talk about basically doubling their throughput almost overnight, and then going on from there for additional increases in throughput.
Yeah.
And
reducing cycle
time from 120-day average
it was an 85% reduction in cycle time.
Which again is not unusual, but it's very nice to see it in one concise picture. The second part of the article is once they had basically applied a pull system and visual control to genetic sequencing is what the article is about. Is basically they would get samples from researchers, and then they'd have to process them through a bunch of stages, and they had a ton of WIP between stages where everyone would just kind of do as much work as they can and push it on to the next department.
Yep.
No one knew where anything was. If a customer called to say, hey, where's my sample, they had to go looking around through all these racks of all this WIP. And then they basically created stations. Between each station, they created a visual buffer with like 5 slots in it, green, orange, red. And if you filled your buffer, you would then go help other people instead of doing more work. And massive reduction. And so then seeing that, they then applied it to their R&D department, which I have to say, reading that, I was just like, oh, all the things. I mean, we have like, it's so, and I think what I'm going to do, my takeaway is just going to be make it visual as the first step.
The R&D scheduling?
My R&D, because it's so easy to just add an idea. I have tons of ideas. And then it's added. And because there's no explicit process that they go through with steps, they're all in one pool together. And I think on different days, I prioritize them differently. Yeah. Because I'm like, oh, I have an idea about this one. And they basically march them through a standard set. And the first one being like viability. Right. And I feel like I think it will just help tremendously. And it helped them way more than double, like multiple fold increase in throughput of the R&D department.
Yeah, which is wild.
By just making it visual. One thing that I thought was very interesting and is they were saying that making that visual, because each sticky note, they were using sticky notes, didn't represent a standard unit of work.
Yeah.
It wasn't sufficient as a way of assessing capacity, just the visual, but that the visual was a really good sort of first pass, right? Like very clearly you can see what has projects, but then there's more discovery that needs to be done to discover, like, is that a 2-day project or a 2-year project?
Yeah.
And I thought that was more relevant to, you had something in here about POLCA.
Yeah. Also, before we go on too much, just to anybody who's considering reading that, it's like a 10-minute read. Like, just go do it. Yeah. It's not an hour-long thing.
And in case the show notes are annoying to access, because sometimes they are, it's from MIT Sloan Management Review, and it's called Breaking Log Jams in Knowledge Work.
Yeah.
So you can type that into Google.
Very good. Also, as I was reading it, I had the realization that we've been trying to organize our shop loosely. It's been sort of a background conceptual goalpost around standard units of measure of work.
Yeah.
And I had this realization as I was reading it that, like, that doesn't apply to many aspects of our shop. Like, it applies to the bottleneck, which is sometimes the machines.
Why does it apply there?
Sort of like we're using that as our metric, as our standard unit of measure, is like runtime on a machine, because that's sort of the constraint of our value add.
Yeah.
But I had the realization that, like, runtime on a machine has, I mean, there's loose correlations, but more or less like zero correlation to like how much time it takes to program, or maybe how long the lead time is for the material. And so trying to apply that as a standard unit of measure may not be appropriate. It might be appropriate. It might be fine.
Interesting. I think it depends on the lens you're sort of looking at it with. Because from the lens of like bottleneck and like, what is it, subjugate everything to the bottleneck, then that could be. But that is, I wonder if is that your true bottleneck, or is that sort of a non-fungible bottleneck? I think you can stay late to program a part.
Right. It's non-fungible. It's somewhat, it's non-negotiable.
Yeah.
I think typically in our shop, the bottleneck tends to be programming, but that is more because the people who program are also doing many other things.
So subjugating to the bottleneck might just be reducing those other things?
Yeah, potentially. Or what we've been trying to do is make the information more, to surface the information more effectively so that it's more clear when the priority is there. Anyway, that was
fascinating.
May not, but just the concept that different stages of the process may need to have different organizing sort of criteria in terms of what is work in process. What is the organizing criteria of the work in process? Maybe it all should be.
I don't quite understand that.
Well, maybe it is true that you should just use the tact of the bottleneck and apply it through the entire organization. But maybe it's not true. Maybe at phase A, where you're doing knowledge work primarily, you should use a different tact that can then feed into a buffer for phase B, where the constraint is, say, machine time, or if it was a bakery, how long it takes to bake a loaf of bread, right? Like that's a non-negotiable. Bread takes this many minutes to be fully baked. Otherwise, people don't want to buy it.
Right. It's mushy.
But ordering the material for the bread may or may not have any, sort of correlation to that tact unit. Anyway, it was just it was an interesting thing that popped into my head.
Interesting.
But yes, a listener reached out about 3 weeks ago. I'm gonna pull up the name. About polka, not the dance or the type.
Although
of
I did
music.
appreciate that they pulled it from a dance, because it is sort of a dance.
True, it is sort of a dance. Sorry, 1 second.
Well, I can sort of go over what it is.
Why don't you jump in?
So polka, parallel cell overlapping loop of cards with authorization. They really wanted it to be Polka. But essentially it is adapting Kanban for pull where you have non-standard jobs flowing through cells. Mm-hmm. And so it is an ability to constrain the whip for each cell by issuing cards, rather than a visual buffer where, like the genome sequencing, they had a buffer between stations that was visual.
Yeah.
I think the problem is if you have stations that are not next to each other or a non-standard routing through a shop. So if each sample had to take a different routing, it's very unclear. Filling the buffers becomes a little more challenging, and which stations need what is just a little more weird. And so you can just have, let's say, 5 cards instead of 5 slots in a visual buffer. Each station has 5 cards that it can trigger it to do work.
Yeah, my understanding was essentially that it was generic Kanban cards that you associate with a particular work order or job as it flows through the cell.
Yeah.
Or station, or whatever the asset is.
That was my understanding as well. I think the problem arises with what we were just talking about, where you have non-standard work in timing. Yep. And so then each card becomes, and they sort of talk about it in some of the articles about Polka.
One thing, and I didn't fully dive in, but one thing that seems to be a critical or a designed in element of it is that everything has scheduled release dates, which was a little interesting to me because that seems counter to true pull. So there is an aspect of pre-scheduling sort of push style mentality, but I don't know if that's necessary. I feel like this, for anybody who's interested and wants to see if it applies, I feel like you could sort of lift this concept of generic cards that represent capacity in a cell or a process within a system, and assigning work that's moving through multiple cells to those cards as they become available, which is more or less what we've tried to do in our shop with the boards. Instead of having actual cards that travel, we have boards that represent those spaces.
Well, yeah, and I would say you are kind of doing exactly this with a slightly different skin on it, because you do have cards. They just travel through the whole process.
Sure. Yeah.
But essentially on each board, like you were saying, they represent, air quotes, a task that is in queue for that process. Yeah. And the exact same problem applies, which is some of them are like 10 minutes and some of them are like a day.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that they say with authorization, which reminded me of the article we referenced, because the station has to accept the work, which is kind of interesting. Oh. Or in the one I was reading about it. And I think that speaks to the same issue, which is like if you have the length of your queue is not dead nuts related to how many cards are in the queue, kind of. Because you can't, like, they're non-standardized lengths. And that has really weird effects on pull versus push. So I would love to know, and I didn't do a ton of reading about this, but I would love to know about like success stories with this.
With Polka.
Yeah, because it's sort of hard for me to wrap my head around exactly how and why it's awesome.
I think the underlying principle seems very sound.
Of using pull.
Of using generic capacity cards. Yeah. I think that makes a ton of sense. I would like to read more about sort of the nitty gritty and nuts and bolts of how this gets applied.
So for you, would that mean that a station, like a job, consumes 3 cards of a CNC because it is 3 units of CNC capacity, or does it consume 1? Right.
This is the nuts and bolts, or the rubber hitting the road.
I guess. That said, you posting this in the notes, it occurred to me that as we build ARDA, we should not, and we already are sort of making this choice, but like more explicitly, not associate a card with a particular task or item. It should just be a card that can be associated with a task or item.
Sure.
But that could also be like Yeah, like a roving or
You're talking about for job management specifically, not so much for like, everything.
no, just everything. Yeah. Like there's no downside of not tying it together.
Yeah.
As long as you can.
Yeah. By the way, Jeremy Neerhoff is who passed this along to us.
Oh, awesome.
Thank you so much for reaching out. We love it. Also, one other note just on the expediting thing being like a narcotic.
Yes.
We recently have fallen into this pretty badly because we took on some work that was quantity work that required 5-axis capability.
Okay.
And now we're just all twisted up. And we're having to do a lot of like, when we have some structures in place to handle this without it being too terribly confusing.
Yeah.
But it's still like a thing. And it's still like, as I do it, I'm like, it's,
why don't you run this for a bit and then that other thing? And
yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. And it's making me realize that we either need to have like we need to either have that capability exist in multiple lanes in our shop, like production and prototyping lanes, so that we can truly make sure that the prototyping lane remains available for prototyping, or we need to not quote production work or not quote prototype.
This feels
work.
like the POLCA thing. You didn't request authorization from the prototyping lane
for
capacity on that machine.
Sure.
Because you do have some capacity, I'd imagine.
We do. It's really the other way, is that the machine was occupied and we did not request authorization for the quick turnaround work. And we just said, we're going to shove this right in the middle.
Oh, I see. Gotcha.
Because this customer is willing to pay for us to get this done on a short lead time.
And so we will. Oh, shit.
Yeah.
Our tool is busy.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, it's, we are considering, not in the immediate sense, but considering trying to bring in a pallet pool type 5-axis solution sometime this year. And theoretically, this could solve that. But I also, as I like sit here thinking about it, I'm like, does it actually solve it, or is it just a weird Band-Aid? More on that later.
Yes. So this reminds me kind of I gave a little talk on kind of lean, whatever. It wasn't titled that. Lean, whatever. And I was trying to sort of distill my learnings a little bit. And one of the things I talked about, which I feel like is relevant here, is the 80-20 idea that like people self-report that 80% of their work is value add, but actually it's 20% is value add and the rest is non-value add.
Yeah.
And how I think companies often pursue improvements on the value add, which we've talked about.
Yeah.
Rather than reducing the non-value add.
So before you go on, do you feel like you get good traction with that?
Oh, that's funny. I guess from the question you think no.
Well, I bring this up very often as well.
Okay.
And I feel like people smile and nod and then immediately talk about how actually they do a lot of value add or how it doesn't apply. And so I'm curious if maybe it's the wrong tack.
It may be the wrong tact. I talked about it anyway.
I'm not saying you shouldn't have. I'm just curious what your success has been.
My success, I would say, generally with lean is very slim, and I think is in line with the number of lean companies you see in the world. I think everyone who gets really into lean and Toyota production and all the rest of it is like, holy shit, this is incredible. How isn't everyone doing this? It must be because they don't know. And then you try to explain it to people and they're like, not interested. So I guess I do feel like it's successful in the people who like really lights their eyes up, right? Where you're like, oh, that's very interesting. But hearing you talk about like the idea that machines are cheap sort of falls into that, where you start to realize like the organizational cost of the expediting, the cost of like all this non-value add, and suddenly if you can kind of reduce that significantly, which I think you are, right, the unlocks are huge, which suddenly makes the investments in machines much more
reasonable.
Reasonable, and like, oh man, we can now flow a lot more value to these machines.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Sorry, I had interrupted you about the talk that you gave. Is that where you're going with that, or was there a different point?
No, my point was just, the 80-20 thing. I feel like just so deeply applies, and like this conversation is just largely about how to reduce that 80%. Yeah. And it's very impactful. Anyway.
Nice. I have a small note here.
Yeah.
Which was just like, I just keep coming back to this as like, what's the concept here? We've talked about it quite a bit, about like how just doing something is so much better than nothing. And these small unlocks of like whatever, using sticky notes or whiteboards or just the simple hot glue and cardboard, right?
Yeah.
And I keep coming back to this for data and communication standardization. Is that a simple text document that's just a standard format of questions has been just like such a huge unlock for us over and over and over again.
Very cool. Where are you applying that?
Well, it's the root of our setup sheets for our setup sheets.
It's just a document you're duplicating, right?
It's a document. It's a simple text document that we duplicate that is, at this point, is a fairly exhaustive list of all the questions you need to answer to allow someone to move forward with setting up a machine. And then this last week, 2 weeks ago, I sort of tried to take that same concept and apply it to a standard format for creating SOPs.
Very nice.
Because we had a discussion as a group and realized that our knowledge base / SOPs document, if you want to call it that, is getting to be good, but it's a little bit slapshod or like scattershot in like how exhaustive a lot of the information is. Because
so like sometimes it's quick notes and sometimes it's really deep manuals kind of.
Yeah, but I just always come across this issue where I am dealing with a problem and I go to document my solution or what I dealt with in that problem, and I have to sit there and go through my head and think through like all the possible things that I dealt with and all the possible solutions that I came up with.
Interesting.
And it's almost guaranteed I will forget one thing or another.
Not anymore.
So I think the key thing I've found here is like using the format of a series of questions is maybe the part that I really wanted to point to as being useful.
Okay.
Because it gets people into the mindset. And if you design your question format properly, it doesn't have to be specific. It can be very broad. It's like an SOP needs to have a few things. And those few things like are always the same. They just pertain to different specific aspects of whatever it is you're doing.
Yeah.
Right. But like the outline is always the same, or it should be within reason.
And where do you keep the standard text file? Is that in Airtable?
It's in our knowledge base sheet as well.
So it's just like template.
Yeah.
SOP or
like,
template.
Yeah. Airtable has like a sorting function based on drop downs.
Oh, cool.
So we just have a bunch of drop downs for what grouping the different things need to be in. And there's a whole section that's just templates.
Very cool.
Yeah.
That is awesome. That kind of reminds me loosely of a point I have in here about in-station quality. So I've been reading the book, the Sales Acceleration Formula, which I'm very much enjoying. And one of the things he talked about, which I am really, hit close to home, was like spending too long on prospects that probably won't convert or not. Mostly that one. And a lot of it just comes down to improper qualification, right? Like, did you qualify the lead? Do they have, and there's a framework he lays out in there, which is, let me see if I can find it real quick. Need, budget, authority, time. And that's basically, do they have the need that you fill? Like for real, not just like, can we wedge them into the thing? Like, are they the person who has the need for the thing you sell? Do they have the budget available, and and do they have the authority to spend that budget? And then what is their timeline? And like, if those things don't line up, there's just no sense for anyone. And something that occurred to me is that we've all been sold things.
Yeah.
And when you want to buy that thing, you're happy to be sold the thing, right? If the salesperson feels like they're actually trying to help you find a solution.
Yeah.
And I think that this idea of not passing, and it sort of is in the R&D pipeline, in sales, in your SOP example, is like, if we can standardize around a way of evaluating pieces of the projects before they get handed to the next step, right? Like the cost to the organization of creating an incomplete SOP is non-zero.
Right.
Best case, it just wastes a bit of time of like, hey, do we remember who did this last time? What is this? It doesn't have everything I need to do my work.
Yeah.
At worst, it causes errors.
Yeah.
And I think, same with a sales pipeline. It's like,
right.
And actually, the more I was thinking about it, I always feel a bit rushed on sales calls to kind of get across to the point of like, here's what we do, so that people can get interested and exciting.
When you're doing sales?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I'm sort of realizing that qualifying for the people who are serious about buying, like asking real questions about like, so what about this problem? What are you experiencing? What are you seeing as the pain points to your organization?
Yeah. This is like the sushi sign thing.
Yeah. If that's top of mind for you, you're going to have no issue speaking to that. Right. And no complaint of like, I don't want to talk about that.
Sure.
It's going to be like, oh, let me dive into it. Especially if it's in the context of like, so we can make sure that we kind of scratch that itch or help you find something that does.
Yeah, that reminds me that like all of the salespeople that I sort of find myself continuing to work with tend to be people who want to know what my problem is and how they can help solve it. Yeah, and that's where they lead, not just being like, here's our amazing thing.
Yeah, and I think so. I really want to make that shift. Like, I think I do that a little, but I think I could do it a lot more. But I think the thing I'm realizing is that there's a huge cost to not doing a good job at every step and passing the next step, even if that's me, passing, like even signing people up who have no business signing up.
Yeah.
Right. Like we've signed up customers who I just like don't see them getting a ton of value out of the product, many of whom because they don't put any items in. Right. So of course they're not getting value. And fundamentally, that was sort of my failure to not be like, hey, this doesn't sound like this is your top issue that every day when you come in, it's going to be top of mind enough to make some progress. Yeah. So anyway.
And like if you're Spotify, that's probably fine, where they're like happy to soak up a bunch of like background, subscription money. Yeah. But for your use case, that is not what you're looking for.
Not at all, especially when we spent company time on signing those people up, on the sales efforts to get them, etc. Yeah. And even if that was 10 minutes, that's a waste. Right? Yeah. Like, because we could have spent 10 minutes on someone who's desperate for our solution, but doesn't know we exist. Yeah. Anyway, so that's sort of been percolating.
Nice.
This is interesting, maybe just to me. I don't know. So spoke to another company, pretty big manufacturer in the US, who had an ERP that they were using to do all of their work, like all their production work.
All their
scheduling, everything. Yeah. And then it was just a nightmare. And so they ended up switching to Kanban on their production floor, getting the ERP off of their production floor.
Just straight up old school paper Kanban.
Paper Kanban that they're making in spreadsheets. Yep. And he was like, we now can tell customers which step their items are on. Yeah.
So this is for high or medium mix, like job shop style work?
I think it's more production. It may have some customization, but I think it's sort of like, my impression is, and I could look at their product offering more, but my impression is sort of like our thing with your logo, or our thing configured this way versus that way.
Okay.
So it is enough that you're not going to hold finished inventory and pull from that.
Yeah.
But I think it's pretty standardized sort of sub-assemblies at least. Anyway, they are now looking at upgrading their ERP. So I was kind of like, are you like, what does that offer? Are you thinking about moving away from Kanban? And he's basically like, no, we're never going to move away from Kanban for production, for picked parts, for like stuff that each station needs constant supply of. But so I didn't get an answer about what they needed from a new ERP, but I just thought that was very interesting. Another company that,
did they, just out of curiosity, was there any sort of insight into what the friction is that they're currently experiencing that they're trying to find a solution to?
I really tried hard to get a conversation on the books with this person. This was over DMs on Instagram. And so, you know, we were at it for 20 minutes and halfway through I was kind of like, man, if we had just jumped on the call, this would be, get a lot more detail there. But anyway, just thought it was interesting. Really, I'm trying to better understand people who have moved away from Kanban and people who have moved to Kanban, even when they're running an ERP, because fundamentally ERPs came out of the accounting world. Yeah. So they're not going away. Toyota uses an ERP.
Sure.
Right. And so it's sort of like, how do they play next to each other, and what's the best advice there? It seems like there's just no solution that's aimed at that problem, strangely.
At which problem?
The problem of like inventory in motion, line side delivery. I shouldn't say that. There are MES, MRPs attempt it, but it's not been a success.
You're talking about a software solution. There's no software solution.
There's no software solution. Okay. Yeah. And so even like they are using software for their Kanban, that software is Google Sheets or something like that. So they are using software. It's just not very specialized for what they're trying to do. And my feeling is, and maybe I'm wrong, that you could offer more streamlined things there. So anyway, just interesting hearing another piece there.
Interesting.
Here's another failure we experieed and a learning. So on-site installs, we did 3 last week. And on the second one, we kind of just went in and like busted our asses to try to like get cards printed. And the thought, I think, like subconsciously, I think my feeling was like at some point there's a tipping point in your business where every item, or where a majority of the items you reach for sort of have an ARTA card, right? And then your organization is pretty bought in. And so then your inclination is like, let's make a card. That was my hunch. I'd love to hear what is behind that. So we were in there like just busting our asses trying to get as much data in and then as many cards printed as possible. And at the end, I was kind of like with the owner, we were sort of talking about the system, and he pointed out the table of like all these cards, which we had divided out by area, etc. And he's like, yeah, this is kind of what I was worried about. Like, I don't, you you guys came in and printed a lot of cards, and I appreciate all the work. And like overall, they were pleased that we had come. But he's like, really, I just needed training across the organization, because like you guys didn't finish, of course, right? Like we have a lot more, and so really we just need to understand like how to think about setting minimums, how to think about organizing shelves effectively, just all these things, and getting people just how to use the software you guys are building, right? So that was, really, it was great feedback. And I think it fixes a lot of problems we've sort of been having with on-sites. Yeah. The biggest one is we sort of ask for company time, right? Like if we came into your shop, which we did. Yeah. In that case, I think you guys were, anyway, at some point we need your team's time to be like, what is this item? How many do you use? Right. And then what is this item? And how many do you use of this? Yeah. Right? We just don't know. And we sometimes struggle where we'll schedule time on site, and then we ask like, hey, can we have someone available to answer all these questions? And they're like, absolutely. We'll have these people. They're yours for the time you're here. And then they're just not. And then we're sort of stuck looking dumb because we can't make as much progress.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think framing the whole thing as more of a training exercise fixes a lot of those things. Teach a man to fish rather than dumping a whole bunch of fish on their shop floor.
I mean, you didn't fully ask for my just like straight up like
let's go.
feedback, but I think a lot of what you said is true. I think people need an organization needs to have enough cards in circulation to see the value. But I think fundamentally more what they need is the ability to create cards quickly and efficiently.
Yeah.
And the enough cards in circulation is to see the value is like purely to trigger the organization to continue to make their own cards and understand the concept. And I think potentially if you were to structure it as a training and say like have a simple question format of a list of things that you want to have prior to your arrival. That's like you want to have had the team that you're going to work with have picked out 10 items, have talked through what their minimums are for those and why and where they're going to put them, just so that everybody's in the right mindset for at least understanding sort of what the constraints of the decisions are going to be and why and how they might want to solve them on a few items. And so that then you can talk as a group and they will already have context about how to do the rest of them.
Yeah. I think that's, I'd be curious to talk more about those simple questions. But yeah, I think that's kind of what we kind of came away with is like, if we could, like the more departments we touch, the faster and easier it's going to be for them.
Yeah.
Because they just have more people making cards.
Yeah.
Assuming they like it.
Totally.
Right.
I recently had an interesting experience, which like surprisingly, this has never happened with any of the equipment we've purchased before. Okay. But we have the CMM coming in next week or the week after. And prior to them scheduling delivery, I had to fill out a whole survey of our facility. Like,
do you have air?
Do you have air? Do you have a floor? What's your temperature? Do you have a forklift on hand? What are the length of the forks? Like,
that sounds like bitter experience talk.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Basic stuff. And some of it was more complex and involved, but enough of a thing for me as the business owner to be like, oh, those are the things I need to think about before this piece of equipment arrives so that everybody can be most efficient about what we're doing whenever
that's awesome
here.
That's interesting that's the first.
It is interesting that's the first. Yeah, everything else has just been like, well, here, this is the day. I hope you have a rigger scheduled, kind of a thing.
Right.
But I think what you're doing specifically is like you're selling software, but you're really not selling software. You're selling like a methodology.
Selling peace of mind. No. Yeah.
You're selling a methodology that has like very, very real constraints with how it interacts with physical goods and with all of the people in the organization. Yeah. And so getting the people thinking through those decisions and constraints, I think is key.
Yeah. I think that's arrival. Right. I think something we've really shied away from, maybe for worse, is we really don't want to be selling lean. We want to be selling a painkiller to the problem of stockouts.
Sure.
Or to the problem of like chaos in your organization and expediting, right? Because the second it's like, hey, read these 5 books, and then it's kind of
sure, yeah,
right. And so I think maybe we overcompensated a bit because fundamentally people do want to. Let's see, if you're trying to fix a problem, like you kind of need to be thinking about it in new ways, presumably. Yeah. If you do things exactly the same, you're going to get the same results. Yeah. So coming in and offering a set of questions that make them think about this problem in a new way, I think would not be a bad move.
I don't think it'd be a bad move. And it doesn't have to be, I mean, you are fundamentally selling a pull system management tool. Yeah. And so like having some stuff that goes along with that
would not be crazy.
Is only appropriate really. Cause if they don't adopt some of those things, the system will fail.
Yeah.
Like if they don't understand that they need to have like backup stock for like the second bin. Right. Like this is not going to work well.
Yeah. And actually to your point, we had a customer at one point who was counting off like 4 into a bag of like screws.
Yeah.
And then it's like, that makes sense based on what we said. But also like a box of screws is $7. So
yeah,
we talked that through and they're like, oh, that totally makes sense. Yep.
Yeah.
Great. But to your point.
Yeah. I think having some basic fundamental, like, here are some choices you can make. You can do 2 bins. You can do 2 bags.
Yeah.
You can do one thing. This is what will happen in each of those scenarios.
Right.
Pick what you want to do for each thing that you're going to create a card for.
And then another piece of learning, and happy to talk about something else here, but was that we actually go on site and there's a lot of different activities we can do, and sort of explicitly separating them. So like one that I'm noticing we need to do before printing cards, or anyone printing card, is like actually just reviewing the names on the cards, because people just name it something, and then you go through and you're like for fasteners, for example, like standardization is awesome, as we've beat that horse to death on this podcast. And then people so it would be nice to sort of think about, hey, how do we want to name fasteners?
Yeah.
And do you guys really care about the alloy, right? A lot of people sort of copy and paste from McMaster, for example. And so you have like 17.4 stainless cap screw, this length, this thread, and you're like, I don't think that's what you're retrieving based on, and it's a really long title. The other is sort of reorder minimums and quantities, and so we've sort of set up a rubric, but I think we can make that into a sheet, like a worksheet, which is basically like, how much do you use in the time, like what's your replenishment time? Start there. How much do you use in that time? Like sort of maximum. Maybe not maximum, but like pick a high number, right?
Right.
And then it's kind of like, do you get bulk discounts, and is the thing cheap enough where that makes sense? It often doesn't, but it often does. Like fasteners, it's like set a minimum of 1 box and a reorder of 1 box.
Yeah.
Because often we see people, like, this was an interesting one, and I think I talked about this, but like a minimum of 20 screws and then reorder 2 boxes of 100. Because in people's head, it's like, well, we're ordering, we may as well get a lot. Assuming the minimum of 20 was sufficient to last you, let's say you have 5 left when the reorder comes in, you have 205 screws. If you just go minimum of 100 and order 100, you're going to have like 185 screws in the building. And so like you have less, even though your minimum is way higher. Anyway, so stuff like that is sort of just reviewing that, because we often go through and like tear through a lot of data, get all the name, and then start printing, and then start placing cards, and then I'm looking at the minimums and I'm like,
this ain't right.
This doesn't make any sense. And also, if we walk over to the shelf, what are you going to do with 200 of these things when they come in? Like, it doesn't fit in the bin you guys own, right? So like, should we get a bigger bin? Should we reduce that reorder quantity?
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't know. So work to do on sort of, I think, systemizing some of that. And some of that is just, and maybe this is letting myself off the hook, but like, I feel like I don't know. We were learning, and now I think we've learned enough to kind of go like, okay, here are the common threads,
right,
or something.
You're seeing the common failure modes.
Yeah, and kind of trying to address that.
I think
I don't know.
I think it's maybe a hard sell, but having the team that you're working with be more involved in making the decisions, I think would be very beneficial. Like the fact, like, it was great to have you guys come in and install in our place, right?
Okay.
Simultaneously, like, there's a lot of stuff where I don't know where it is, and it's not necessarily super intuitive to me to find it. And it works, but it probably would work better if one of our people did a bunch of it.
So let me ask you this, and this is the perfect as someone who experienced the install, my feeling, and maybe this is incorrect, or maybe there's a third answer here. My feeling is that if we had sort of burdened the experience significantly with like, hey, we're going to need someone available the whole time, we're going to need X, Y, and Z, that you might have been like, that sounds awesome, but like we're really busy right now, or something like that.
Maybe. I mean, I think you're walking a balancing act here, where it's like, do this with 10 products. I think the training focus shifts the whole thing, because then the measurement of success is not, did they come in and place a ton of cards,
the measurement of success is kind of like, hey, is everyone comfortable with the software and how to think through organizing a shelf? And
yeah. And there's lots of little, like, for example, a small detail I noticed today was like, you came in, you did the install. Fantastic. Like, you made a rack for a bunch of our boxes for shipping.
Right.
We don't use those boxes anymore.
Right.
It's like, and that was half hour of your time probably.
Yeah.
That like definitely would have been more beneficial towards training. And so like, but having the foresight to know exactly where those things are going to be is impossible. So
so does the format of like, hey, we're going to come in and we'd love to schedule an hour with a person in each, like an hour with each person on the team who you want trained, and we're going to go through 5 items that they don't like running out of. We're going to help them think through the minimums. We're going to have them create the cards. Is that an appealing?
Yeah, probably. Or I would probably like to see it more as like a survey kind of format where it's like pick 10 things, make these 10 decisions, and then we will arrive and we'll discuss why you made those decisions and if they make sense, and then we'll implement as a group.
Okay.
So your team is going to discuss with our team. We're going to walk through these decisions. Then we're going to make the cards and implement those specific items that you all picked as being important. And you've all thought through it already. And then we might change how the implementation looks based on discussion as both teams together. I think that's personally what I would be like, oh, that sounds cool. Versus having you guys like hand off to like, because again, making cards, there's some friction there, but really the friction is thinking through the sort of like guiding principles, the rubrics of how you make these decisions. Yeah. And doing that one-on-one with 5 people in a row doesn't seem very helpful versus having a team with some preamble and context.
Interesting. Yeah. Cool. Well, that's super helpful. I appreciate it. Hopefully this isn't boring to everyone working through the pains of...
I mean, I think this generally applies too, right? Like this isn't just an issue that you're having. This is also a management strategy within a company. Yeah. So I think this is just would be my general approach, would be to get everybody together, talk it through, even if it seems like the morning meeting I was referring to where someone said, yeah, I don't really believe that, but whatever, I'm choosing to trust you. Right. Like that person was not involved in that part of the process, but I still want to have them there because they may have feedback from personal experience from other aspects of the business. Yeah. That, or even a question, right? Like sometimes a question, just because someone doesn't have context, can send the conversation off in a whole direction that that wouldn't have happened and was really critical. Otherwise. Yeah. So
cool. Well, that's super helpful.
But yes, sorry to beat the dead horse some more.
Very helpful. Awesome. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap.
Great place.
Thanks all for listening. Apologies about the audio last 2 episodes. We're back on our better microphones, so hopefully, moving forward, that won't happen again.
We will be continually improving.
After that slight deprovement. You can find me at austere_manufacturing on Instagram and austeremfg.com. Also arda.cards on the internet and on Instagram.
You can find me at lichen_mfg on Instagram, lichenprecision.com on the internet. The pod at incremental CI on Instagram. Tag us with improvements. I've been trying to get back on that game a little bit.
Yes, I've also been trying to check the Instagram more with like every 24 hours because people would often tag us and I missed the ability to retag or repost. So
and we will see you soon.
Yes, we will.